All right. Well, thank you for the songs this morning. I really appreciate how that Joe has captured gospel hope in that song much better than the original. How that our hope lies in that hallelujah, in that praise the Lord, because He does all things for the praise of the glory of His grace, and it really is for our good, for our benefit. All right, let's turn to Isaiah chapter 10. We are continuing through the book of Isaiah. Uh, this is message number 16, entitled Arrogant Assyria. And we're going to be looking at verses 5 through 19 here in chapter number 10. So I'm going to read verses 5 and 6 as we get started. O Assyrian, the rod of my anger, and the staff in their hand is mine indignation. I will send him against the hypocritical nation, and against the people of my wrath will I give him a charge to take the spoil and to take the prey and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. So after opening up with a bright, hope-filled prophecy of the coming king and kingdom in chapter 9, Isaiah returns to the warning of judgment. And of course, time was quickly running out for the northern kingdom, and yet they continued on. They continued on in their pride, their greed, their false sense of security, and a lot because of the confidence that they had in their new friends, the alliance with the nation of Aram. They continued pursuing wealth through injustice and sinful means, and they consoled themselves that we've heard all this before. This message of death and destruction and devastation, we've heard all that before. The calamity will come. We'll recover. We'll build greater houses and so on. It's the kind of thinking that acknowledges what's coming, doesn't necessarily deny the reality, the truth of what's coming, but just arrogantly thinks, I can weather the storm. I can beat it. Well, Isaiah repeated this chilling refrain throughout that part of chapter 9 and the first part of chapter 10 concerning this exile of the northern kingdom, that God's wrath wouldn't be exhausted by it. Don't think that you can wipe your brow and say, that's over, because there's more to come. So God is not only concerned, though, with Israel, and Israel certainly wasn't the only arrogant nation, as chapter 10 proceeds with this woe to Assyria. Assyria essentially became the poster child for success going to your head. They thought themselves great and invincible, but they would find out otherwise. So this chapter, here in chapter 10, it's one of those great places that we don't want to not understand the context and the contextual meaning. But it's one of those great places where we can come and learn a lot about God's sovereignty and human responsibility. And that seems to be a question that people always wrestle with, always struggle with. God is the creator, and He's the sovereign ruler over the entire creation. So when you think about prophecy, what prophecy really is not a prediction of the future, as God just revealing beforehand what He is going to do, what is going to happen, because He has ordered it so. How could all of these things come to be and work together if God had not ordered it so? And it's just sort of, as I was thinking on this passage, it just reminded me of that great old Isaac Watts hymn, which is not one of his popular hymns, but it is a great one. Let the whole race of creatures lie, abased before their God. Whate'er His sovereign voice has formed, He governs with a nod. 10,000 ages ere the skies were into motion brought, all the long years and worlds to come stood present to His thought. There's not a sparrow or a worm but's found in His decrees. He raises monarchs to their throne and sinks them as he please. If light attends the course I run, 'tis he provides those rays, and 'tis his hand that hides my sun, if darkness clouds my days. Yet I would not be much concerned, nor vainly long to see the volume of his deep decrees, what months are writ for me. When he reveals the book of life, oh, may I read my name amongst the chosen of his love and followers of the Lamb. One of my favorite Isaac Watts hymns, but again, not one of his real popular ones. God's sovereignty here in this passage is seen in the determination and the ordering of events, and as well as him keeping score, because his judgment is going to come on Assyria, though he expresses and reveals very clearly that he is appointing Assyria to the task that they are doing. He's going to reward them according to their sins, and that's just what we're told that God is going to do for every man and woman, everyone that has descended from Adam and Eve. And of course, those will be accounted for and rewarded either in the person or have been in the person of Jesus Christ. So we're going to look at this in three parts, verses 5 to 11, where God explains that Assyria, which is coming against Israel and Judah as well, how Assyria is the rod of his anger. In verses 12 to 14, he describes the judgment, and in verses 15 to 19, their destruction. So let's begin here again, verses 5 and 6. O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger, and the staff in their hand is mine indignation. I will send him against an hypocritical nation, and against the people of my wrath will I give him a charge, to take the spoil and to take the prey, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. Now, this word that begins here, "oh," is here. It's most often translated "woe," and it's the same word that appeared back at the beginning of chapter number 10. It's that prophetic interjection. It is a judgment pronouncement. "O Assyrian." Assyria is described here as the rod of God's anger. In other words, this nation, this empire of Assyria that had been ascending for quite some time by this point to a real world power, they were a tool. They were an instrument in God's hand, an instrument with which he was punishing Israel and even punishing Judah to an extent, though they did not affect Judah's exile like they did the northern kingdom. Now, Assyria, during this particular time frame that we are in, rose to a great power and a lot of conquest of many different nations under particularly four kings. So Tiglath-Pileser III, from 745 to about 727 BC. Right after that, Shalmaneser, the fifth, which reigned from 726 to 722. And 722 was when the northern kingdom was taken away. Samaria was taken. The king Sargon the second, 721 to about 705 BC, and then Sennacherib from 705 to about 681 BC. So under Sennacherib was when you had sort of the final scattering and the importation of all the settlers into the land of northern Israel, which essentially finally sort of ended that kingdom for good. And of course, he was the one that came against Jerusalem that Isaiah talks about later in chapters 36 and 37, which he did not succeed. Now, he says that he's going to send Assyria. God says, I'm sending Assyria against a hypocritical nation and against the people of my wrath. And we have both the terms there, singular goy, a nation, one of those rare instances where Israel is referred to as a nation, as a goy, and then the singular the people of my wrath. So we have both of those used here in reference to Assyria. And what he says is that God will use Assyria essentially to, one of the imagery here is trampling underfoot, like a muddy path or something that's just been trampled with the feet of humans and animals. He's going to trample them down, and he's going to spoil Israel. And you remember the name of the child, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, that we looked at earlier, the hastening to the spoil. It's as Assyria is being called to this spoil. Now, we certainly don't need to ask why. In other words, why is Assyria going to be punishing Israel? I mean, we have the preserved history of the sins of the nation and the promises of judgment. As I said, there's no possible way they could plead ignorance at this point. Well, judgment, where did this come from? Why is this coming on us? So here, right at the start, we're seeing God's sovereignty in ordering the affairs of nations. It's not a coincidence that Assyria has risen to power independently from Israel. That's not a coincidence, nor does it mean that Assyria has embraced Yahweh as the true and living God. No, they're a nation, a wicked nation. They're going about all of the things they're going about, and of course, this passage pronounces judgment on them. So God has raised them up to do His will in punishing Israel and Judah. Now, the prophet Habakkuk actually similarly wrestled with the situation when the Babylonians were being used against Judah. He really had difficult questions, and read that whole book again. It's going to address these same kind of issues. He's wondering how he understood why God was angry against the southern kingdom of Judah. He's understood their sins and all the covenant breaking that they were guilty of. He understood all of that. But what he did not understand was how could God use the Babylonians, which were worse in many ways. How could He use the Babylonians? How could He pick them up? How could the holy hand of God pick up a wicked people like the Babylonians and use them as a rod against His own people by His own revelation and declaration as a weapon against them or an instrument to punish them? So Isaiah is not wrestling with that question. Habakkuk was, but it's a very similar situation. And God speaks of Assyria. He says, I'll give him a charge. In other words, God's saying, I'm commanding, or we could say appointing. I'm appointing Assyria to this task. Now, Assyria, again, was a wicked empire. They were not a righteous empire, and that comes out in the passage. But how could God use such a wicked people to do His will? And furthermore, how could He then turn around and hold them accountable for their actions, which is exactly what this passage tells us? Well, just to give a brief answer to that would be, Paul gives an answer in Romans chapter 1, particularly Romans chapter 9, verses 1 to 29. He gives the answer, and it's very clear. But I've seemed to find that we just don't like that answer very much. We want some other answer, but Paul gives that answer very well in Romans chapter 9. So if you're interested in that, you can reread that chapter. Verse number 7, howbeit he meaneth not so, neither doth his heart think so, but it is in his heart to destroy and to cut off nations, not a few. So God says, I've appointed Assyria to this task. And even though God had ordered Assyria, as it were, to punish Israel and Judah, what he says here in verse 7 is that wasn't their intention. It wasn't the intention of Assyria to do God's will. That was not their intention in their actions. Now, this is where the responsibility comes in. So we've seen the sovereignty. God has ordered all things so that he raised up the Assyrian Empire. Now He's using them as an instrument, as a tool against Israel. And now He's saying, but that's not how Assyria sees it. That's not how they thought about it. That was not their intention. They were not faithfully seeking to do God's will. In fact, they had no knowledge of God's will. Now, I know there's the statements like 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 25, about serving the God of Israel, but when you look at that and read it in context, it's a mockery. It's not sincerity. It's somewhat ironic, you could say, but it's not sincere. They had no idea what God's will was, and they didn't care, much less. They were doing what they wanted to do. And that's what he's telling us in this passage. That wasn't their thoughts. That wasn't their intention. In their mind, they were destroying and cutting off nations, as many as they could. In other words, in their minds and in their hearts, they wanted to take over the world. They were conquering every nation that they could. So that was their thoughts, their goals. So Assyria, we can see them here being described. They were power hungry. They were empire building. They wanted to conquer nations. They wanted to rule the world, and they were setting about to accomplish that. And it furthered their own goals to make an alliance with Ahaz and with Judah. They weren't joining themselves to Judah because they had turned from their wicked ways and were trusting and committing to Yahweh. That wasn't why they joined in an alliance. No, they saw it as further serving their purpose of conquering the nations, which once they were done with Israel, they turned their attention toward Judah. Now, verses 8 to 11. For he saith, are not my princes altogether king? Not Calno as Carchemish, is not Hamath as Arpad, is not Samaria as Damascus? As my hand hath found the kingdoms of the idols, and whose graven images did excel them of Jerusalem and of Samaria, shall I not, as I have done unto Samaria and her idols, Jerusalem and her idols? So this is giving an expression. It's giving an expression of the thoughts of Assyria. It's not that these were literal words that an Assyrian king uttered or something, but it's revealing the heart of that empire. And remember, the contrast was God has ordered the Assyrians thus, but that wasn't their intention. This is their intention. This was their thoughts as they were conquering nations. They were pursuing domination. These cities that are mentioned were the capitals of different nations that they had conquered. In other words, it's sort of like a quick summary list of all of their conquests, and it's given in the sense of saying, look, we've conquered all of these. Well, it's not going to be any great thing to conquer Jerusalem. Even they had their sights set on Jerusalem and Judah. It's the thoughts of pride. Because they had conquered these cities and nations, they would likewise conquer all cities and nations that they endeavored to do so. In other words, we could just simply say they thought they were unstoppable. They thought that they were invincible because of all of these past conquests. Notice also how that in their thoughts they mocked the gods of the nations. They conquered all these different nations, and all of these different nations, they would worship and serve various gods, and none of those gods were able to deliver. And so generally the pagan nation would then assume our gods are stronger than their gods. Our gods are greater than their gods if they were able to conquer that nation. And they were mocking them. But not only did they do that, but did you notice how they also expressed the same concerning Jerusalem? They assumed that the Yahweh of Israel in taking Jerusalem and Samaria was like the gods. It's just another god. It's just another god. And the gods of Assyria are stronger and greater than the gods of Israel, and so on. In other words, this is a most serious offense and a sin against God to assume that God is like other gods, like the gods of the nations, like the gods of various religions that we could point to. So it was a false confidence that they had in their pride, and an assumption that their gods were great and strong and greater than those of the other nations, including Israel and Judah. Then we get to the judgments beginning here in verse 12. Wherefore it shall come to pass that when the Lord hath performed his whole work upon Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, I will punish the fruit of the stout heart of the king of Assyria and the glory in his high looks. So he describes this work of God. In other words, God has a purpose and he has a work to perform in Jerusalem. Now, he's directly describing the Assyrian invasion as God's work. And I don't think there's any need to try to split hairs over this sort of thing. God had work to be accomplished in Israel and Judah, and the use of Assyria was one of the means by which God was working out his purpose. And he used the Assyrians, appointing them to it, which they carried out, as he's already stated, not to do God's will, but to accomplish their own plans. And notice what he's saying in verse 12. He says, when it comes to pass, in other words, when God's purpose for the Assyrians against Judah in Jerusalem, when that's been accomplished, when that's done, which meant the exile of the northern kingdom and the crippling of the southern kingdom, he says he will then judge Assyria. And he describes Assyria as having stubborn wills and having proud eyes. And really, the greatness of their offense is magnified by the greatness of the one that they are sinning against. Verses 13 to 14. For he saith, by the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I am prudent, and I have removed the bounds of the people, and have robbed their treasure, inhabitants like a valiant man. And my hand hath found people, and as one gathereth eggs that are left, have I gathered all the earth, and that moved the wing, or opened the mouth, or peeped. So he's now once again, this is an expression of what is in the heart and the mind of the Assyrians, capturing that thought when they coming against Israel and against Judah. They thought themselves great, and they credited all of their supposed successes to their own strength and their own wisdom. We are a great empire. They're describing their victories, this eggs from the nest, they're describing their victories essentially as being easy. It's just like going out to gather up the eggs. And they said, we've gathered them from all over the earth, and nobody's made a peep. Nobody's stirred at us. They've not been able to stop us. No one could withstand. No one could successfully resist. Now, that's their thoughts. So what we see here really is just something of a classic human error, and that is a misinterpretation of events, a misinterpretation of circumstances. In other words, all of the victories, all the conquests, and all the power that Assyria had gained, and as much as they had increased their territory, all of those things they interpreted as being sort of a sign that they were strong and mighty, and that they were wise and prudent, and that all things were essentially on their side and working out in their favor in order to accomplish their goals. And we get glimpses of this many times in the Bible, of misinterpretation of events and circumstances, enough that I would think it would make us very cautious about interpreting events and circumstances that we encounter. You can think of Jacob. When Joseph was, he thought, taken from him and killed, he thought everything was against him. All these events, all of these things were working together for his hurt. But then by the time we get to Egypt and we find Joseph there, and Joseph gives interpretation of the events, it's God was saving Israel. Boy, it seemed like he had a strange way of doing it, but that's what he was doing. And Jacob was wrong about what all those events meant. Nebuchadnezzar, congratulating himself on the great and powerful kingdom that he had built, and actually viewing his accomplishments as being monuments to his honor. No doubt thinking that he would be worshiped long after that he was gone. Well, these are times of either great ignorance or forgetfulness. But Nebuchadnezzar would go on to say, this is Daniel chapter 4, verses 34 and 35, and at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High. And I praise and honor to him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? So the Assyrians had likewise misinterpreted the events and circumstances of their victories. And we're very quick. We're very quick to act similarly. We're quick to think how our own hard work and our own planning and our own wisdom and everything have just been the reason for our success. Now, certainly, if we understand Ecclesiastes, it's better to have wisdom, and it is right to do things wisely, but don't forget that the outcome is in the Lord's hands. And yes, sometimes he gives us the work of our hands, both in a good and a bad sense, depending on what his purpose is. But that outcome is of the Lord. God is greatly offended by his creatures taking credit to themselves and not thankfully acknowledging God's grace and his hand in our lives. And that it is his plan that he is working out, not our own. We don't get God to do things for us in order to accomplish our goals, so to speak. God is working out his purpose. And if our prayer is according to his will, then it will be done. It will be given. But if it is not, then it won't. Verses 15 to 19 speak of this destruction that is coming. Verse 15, and the Lord shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea, and with his mighty wind. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong chapter here. Verse 15 in chapter 10. Shall the axe boast itself against him that heweth therewith, or shall the saw magnify itself against him that shaketh it? As if the rod should shake itself against him that lift it up, or as if the staff should lift up itself as if it were no wood? So, should the hammer arrogantly boast that he had built a great house? Should the wrench take glory to itself for building a beautiful and useful machine? And of course, this is much like the potter and the clay. Isaiah refers to that later in chapter 64. Jeremiah refers to it in chapter 18. Paul refers to the potter and the clay imagery in Romans chapter 9 as well. So think about how quick that we are to detect when someone steals our glory. When someone takes credit for the idea that I had, or they take credit for the words that I came up with and spoke. And I had an experience a few years back. For several years, I used to do a lot of writing and publishing those things. And I saw a person make a post, and I knew this person, and I knew that they read my writings, and they put a quote and said something about, I thought about this quote this morning, and it was really well put, and don't remember where I heard it. And I immediately thought, I wrote that. And, a little while later, it's kind of gnawing at me in the back of my mind. I'm like, how hard is it today with all the technology for them to have looked that quote up and to been able to have found the source? A little while later, as it's still kind of gnawing in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm going to prove how easy that this is to look this quote up. So I type it in quotes with Google, come back to research, and it was a different author in a book written long, long ago that I had read many years ago and just hadn't thought about word for word that quote. And I had said the very same thing, not even realizing that I was quoting and stealing from someone else. Well, we're very quick to pick up on when we think somebody's taking credit that we deserve. But think about how magnified that offense is when we are taking credit, what belongs solely to God Almighty, to ourselves. And that's exactly what is being referred to. The Assyrians were congratulating themselves, taking this credit for their ascendancy, not even thinking that God had raised them up, that these outcomes were in the Lord's hands, that they had risen to the place that they had. And in the last few verses here, verses 16 to 19, therefore shall the Lord of hosts, send among his fat ones leanness, and under his glory he shall kindle a burning like the burning of a fire. And the light of Israel shall be for a fire, and his Holy One for a flame. And it shall burn and devour his thorns and his briars in one day, and shall consume the glory of his forest and of his fruitful field, both soul and body. And they shall be as when a standard bearer fainteth. And the rest of the trees of his forest shall be few, that a child may write them. Describing this judgment that is going to come on Assyria. God, it's therefore, because of this, because of their sins of pride and their idolatries and no doubt many other things, God will bring this judgment. And he uses imagery here that gives us depictions of sort of fast destruction and slow destruction. The light of Israel and the Holy One of Israel, these are messianic titles. And it combines the coming of Christ as both the hope of Israel and also the divine warrior to execute vengeance on all of his enemies. And here his coming is compared to a fire that is going to quickly consume and devour all of his adversaries. And this judgment that is described a little more slowly has the idea of a disease coming upon, of just wasting away. And we get, of course, the judgment that came on the Assyrians, particularly Isaiah chapters 36 and 37, and in the days of Hezekiah, when they came against Jerusalem, but were not successful under Sennacherib. The prophet Nahum also prophesied about the fall of Assyria and the fall of Nineveh as the Medo-Babylonian Empire conquered them, and they became the conquered. That took place essentially 629 to 605 BC, finally falling at that Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. So this extent of judgment is captured in this image at the end as well, the consuming of the forest. And there's going to be so few trees that a young child will be able to count them all in a forest. That's just the imagery that is used. Described as just a decimation of the Assyrian army. Well, this passage is one of those passages that gives us one of those rare glimpses behind the scenes. Like I said, we're very prone to misinterpret events, and we can do that positively and in our favor, and we can actually do that negatively, and we're just not very good at interpreting the events and circumstances of our lives. And this is one of those rare glimpses sort of behind the scenes of what all is going on in the rise of the Assyrian Empire, its expansion, and its conquest of Israel, and almost conquest of Judah. Now, you can read the histories of these in the books of the Kings and the Chronicles, and they relate a lot of the actions that took place. But here, the prophets are giving us sort of a different perspective on these events. So such passages give us, again, that clear revelation of God's sovereignty, that He is ordering all of these events. These are according to His purpose. But not only of God's sovereignty, it gives us clear revelation of that human responsibility, because the Assyrians weren't repenting of their sins either, and they're going to be accountable, and they're going to be judged for it. So God's use of Assyria to accomplish His purposes, and maybe this is something that we struggle with, but God's use of Assyria to accomplish His purpose doesn't condone the Assyrians, nor does it excuse them. And that's very clear in this passage. We probably don't like to accept it maybe, but it's very clear in this passage. And once again, the solution, so to speak, to this quandary is always to come back to, what is our responsibility? Our responsibility is not to try to read and interpret the signs of the times and the events and the circumstances of our lives. And our responsibility is spelled out very clearly. And our responsibility is to God's word. It is to do what He tells us in his word to do and not do what he tells us not to do. He's revealed what he wants us to do, and we are responsible to do it. So we're not trying to play angles and guess what God's secret was. We do not comprehend all of God's ways. We certainly they are far beyond us. His thoughts, his purposes, his will, it's far beyond what we can comprehend. But what he wants of us, he's revealed to us clearly in his word, and that's always what we are responsible to do. All right, we'll stop here and close with a hymn.